Boa noite a todas e a todos. Hello, everyone. Eu vou agora, nessa sessão final de conferencistas, apresentar para vocês a nossa conferencista Karen Brown, que é professora sênior em História da Arte e Estudos de Museus e Galerias na Universidade de St. Andrews, na Escócia, e diretora do Instituto de Pesquisas em Museus, Galerias e Coleções dessa mesma instituição. Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem as relações entre patrimônio, memória e comunidades, bem como as relações entre artes visuais e literatura. Karen Brown estudou História da Arte e Arquitetura no Trinity College, em Dublin, tornando-se curadora em arte dessa universidade e realizando uma pesquisa de pós-doutorado na Universidade de Cambridge e no Trinity College de Dublin. Ela já publicou diversos artigos e livros sobre temas como museus, comunidades e desenvolvimento sustentável e é atualmente membro do board do ICOFOM. Entre 2016 e 2020, ela coordena um projeto de pesquisa financiado pela Comissão Europeia Horizon 2020, intitulado EULAC Museums, Museus e Comunidade, Conceitos, Experiências e Sustentabilidade na Europa, na América Latina e no Caribe. Atualmente, ela contribui com o projeto especial do ICOFOM, Museus, Ação Comunitária e Descolonização. Eu apresento, então, a vocês a nossa conferencista dessa sessão, Karen Brown. Now in English, Karen Brown is Senior Lecturer in Art History and Museum and Gallery Studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and Director of the school's Museums, Galleries and Collections Research Institute. Her research interests concern relationships between cultural heritage, memory, and communities, as well as interrelations between the visual arts and literature. Karen's first studied art history and architecture with French at Trinity University in Dublin, after which she was employed as a university curator of art and as a Marie Curie postdoctoral research fellow at University of Cambridge and at Trinity College in Dublin. She has several publications on the topics of museums, communities, and sustainable development, and she currently serves on the boards of ICOM's museology group, ICOFOM. From 2016 to 2020, she's coordinating a research project funded by the European Commission Horizon 2020 program called EULAC Museums, Museums and Community, Concepts, Experiences, and Sustainability in Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And she's now a partner in the ICOFOM special project Museums, Community Action, and Decolonization. I hereby present to you our keynote speaker, Karen Brown.
Firstly, thank you very much to Bruno and the research team at UNIRIO for the kind invitation to speak at this webinar and for organising this timely discussion. I look forward to listening to the various contributions and subsequent debates over these 2 days. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that research into community museums, their characteristics, potentialities, and how they can be defined is an ongoing research project for me, and has proven to be far from straightforward. It's also been heavily influenced by collaboration with the fantastic Horizon 2020 EULAC Museums team from the Caribbean, Chile, Costa Rica, France, Peru, Portugal, Scotland, and Spain, with whom I've had the privilege to work since 2016 on the topic of museums, community, and sustainability. Also to note that this paper is work in progress towards 2 forthcoming publications in the new year with community museums as their focus. Firstly, the EULAC Museums Results Booklet, summarising the main achievements of our 4 years of collaborative research between our institutions in Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean. Inside this book, I've worked closely with Karen Weil from Chile and Marie Claverie from France to summarise the journey that we've been on together in thinking around community-based museums in this ambitious project, and to create a chapter in which we reflect on understandings of community museums in our different regional contexts. Secondly, a forthcoming chapter in an edited book aimed at Routledge ICOM monograph series called Shared Histories and Climate Action, Communities and Museums in the 21st Century, that I'm co-editing with Alessandra Cummins and Ana Sol Gonzalez, that we hope will be in press in 2021. And finally, as a key outcome of the EU-LAC Museums project already in print, I would draw attention to our compendium called On Community and Sustainable Museums of 2019, featuring lengthy chapters by the real experts in this field, namely Teresa Morales of Mexico, Peter Davis of the UK, and Hugh de Vereen from France. The book is co-edited by Peter Davis, Luis Raposo, and myself, and consists of three main parts. Part 1 focuses on community and sustainable museums, concepts and key features. Part 2 on creating and sustaining community museums and eco-museums. And Part 3, where I have a selection of community and sustainable museums from our project partner countries. So the premise of our EU-LAC Museums project is that bi-regional research into this topic of museums, community and sustainability will encourage mutual understanding between the European and Latin American and Caribbean regions, and also help us, of course, to learn from each other in overcoming cross-cutting societal challenges. It's a project greatly supported by the presidents of the regional alliances ICOM Europe and ICOM LAC, namely Luis Raposo of Portugal, Samuel Franco Arce of Guatemala, and since 2019, in her capacity as president of ICOM LAC, Beatriz Espinosa of Chile, who's also a project advisor. The research project has also been privileged to overlap with a number of ICOFOM debates, including conferences on the museum definition itself. Our project concept of community museums has its origins in the historic Round Table on the role of museums in relation to the social and economic needs of modern-day Latin America, held in Santiago de Chile in 1972. As most listeners to this webinar will be well aware, this event brought together museologists from Central and South America, rural development specialists, and representatives from UNESCO and ICOM. The subsequent declaration of 1973 and related new museology movement put forward the idea of an integral museum, a concept emphasising the primary responsibility of museums to meet the needs of their communities. The idea that a museum should be at the service of society and its development, a phrase found in the UNESCO Declaration of 1972, was also reproduced then in the 1974 ICOM definition of museum, and has continued to be so right up to the present day. In trying to map out the major milestones in the development of integral museums, it's helpful to consider the socio-political contexts surrounding major movements, not only for museums, but also relating to human rights and sustainable development. To this end, our undergraduate research assistant, James Rowland, has been working hard on a timeline of community-based museums that could be used for researchers and teachers alike. This timeline is work in progress, and we're very open to feedback, especially from ICOFOM and Bruno's wonderful UNIRIO research group, and I'd like to follow up with them on that in due course. The recommendations of the Mesa Redonda in the decade following 1972 were largely not taken up in Latin America, as they entered into a rather dark period of history, but this timeline can be used to illustrate how, in Latin America, the various declarations, conventions and resolutions since then have reinstated the importance of the new museology movement and emphasised the role that community-based museums could play. example, in 1992, the Declaration of Caracas began a series of subsequent similar declarations, emphasising the main points of the Integral Museum, namely, a commitment to developing mechanisms allowing integral museums to work with the community in the protection of heritage, and to involve the community in museum policies and decisions. Also, of course, Mexican initiatives going beyond this, including the all-important creation of the Union of Community Museums in the Mexican state of Oaxaca in 1991, and the creation of the National Programme for Community Museums in 1993, that have subsequently served as significant examples for the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America. It goes without saying then that the 1970s was a turning point for museology, setting in motion a new type of museum and a new focus on museums for the collective good. In her very helpful and often cited Un Museo Sostenible of 2008, Georgina De Carli goes on to discuss the changing trends in new museology between around 1988 and 2008 that challenge the functions and practices of traditional museums. Herein, she posits that while some traditional museums learnt from the new museology, more often they felt a mistrust and threatened by the possibility of community participation and decision-making powers for museum activities and policies. She also cautions against the tendency to, I quote, radicalise the various museum concepts within the new museology, including eco-museums and community museums, thereby losing the essence of the mesa redonda concept of the integral museum, call to change. In thinking around possible definitions of a community museum, in 1993 the Mexican National Programme for Community Museums defined them as one that was born in, created, run and managed by the community. The same elements were present in the definition offered by Museus Comunitarios, a body created in 2008 by the Inter-American Foundation on Culture in partnership with the Union of Community Museums of Oaxaca, and indeed directed by our EU-LAC Museums project advisor, Teresa Morales, and her husband, Guatamoc Camareno Ocampo. Their manual for creating community museums of 2009 called for the whole community to be involved in the decision-making processes of museum curation, in the gathering of the museum's collections, and in the selection of topics that were to be covered. Essentially, through such involvement, the community then holds a stake in the museum. It's their vision that's being projected and their objects that are being shown. And the community museum has the capacity to become more socially sustainable, if you like, through collective decision-making processes. The strength of the community museums is further underpinned by the connections they build with other communities in the network, who can provide expertise and additional support when needed. And to learn more about these important processes, I would point you to their website and also to Professor Morales' essays in our EU-LAC compendium on community and sustainable museums mentioned earlier. And yet, as our project advisor and former Secretary General of ICOM, Hugh de Vereen, has pointed out, when speaking about small to medium-sized museums and their communities, regional, national and local specifics are myriad. For him, there is no homogeneous international concept of a local community museum. De Vereen and his colleague Jacques-Georges-Henri Rivière initiated the Eco-Museum movement in Dijon, in France, in 1971, as we know, at a time when ecology and environmentalism were gaining ground as critical issues for society. As we know, this initiative is still going strong and evolving, and as Peter Davis's research has made clear, eco-museums can be found all over the world and often in sites of outstanding natural beauty, such as Staffen on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, or San Vicente de Nicoya in Costa Rica. As defined by Davis, who I'm pleased to say is also a project advisor, the eco-museum is, I quote, a community-based museum or heritage project that supports sustainable development. So in this context, local people designate their own territory, encompassing aspects of landscape such as geology and scenery, built heritage such as architecture, natural heritage and intangible heritage, such as dialect, songs, stories, and ideas of place, territory, identity, development and democracy are then fully accepted discourses for a range of local and regional museums, who are all engaged in social action. Ideas of place, territory, identity, development and democracy are now fully accepted discourses for local and regional museums that are engaged in social action. And as we know, this impetus has been spurred on in recent years by processes of globalization itself, which have increased people's search for the local and a sense of place, as well as a sense of self. In the words of de VIII, the museum is an institution. An eco-museum is an invention. It is something that is invented by people, by usually several people, to answer local questions. Carrying out a comparative analysis into these small, medium-sized rural museums and their communities in the EU and LAC regions, our EU LAC Museums project has sought to develop associated history and theory relating to museums, communities and territory. In navigating between these two impressive historic movements, communities on one hand and eco-museums on the other, we've sought to research state-of-the-art initiatives in museums and community empowerment in Europe and LAC, and then move beyond these initiatives to create new research prisms with the ability to foster good relations between our regions through exploring shared histories and common vision. Throughout this process, we found ourselves oscillating between pushing the boundaries of given definitions and trying to locate a working definition for our own project. In this sense, the term community-based museums became key to the process, providing a cornerstone for bi-regional museological understanding between us. The forthcoming results booklet maps our collective process of understanding community-based museums in Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, including a first debate during the kick-off meeting held in the National Museum of Archaeology in Lisbon in 2016. Here we asked our group 3 simple questions. 1. What are 3 questions you would ask to determine whether a museum was a community museum? 2. Think of 3 things that a community museum is not. 3. What is the definition of a community museum that would be useful to you in your work? Include 3 main aspects. This process on the day was led by our colleague Anne Gunn from the University of St Andrews, Teresa Morales and Karen Weil from Chile. And in the words of Karen Weil, our principal investigator there, she said, "During this initial meeting and workshop, we found ourselves encountering for the first time the challenge of developing modes of research that took into account our differences, prejudices and diversity. The collective process threw into sharp relief the fact that a certain lack of information and context existed in each of the regions, and these were areas where we could grow as researchers, facilitators, teachers and trainers. Regional differences became quickly apparent. For example, a researcher from France considered a community to be, I quote, a group of people who agree to acknowledge certain characteristics, cultural, political, etc., and or interests in common. Whereas a researcher from Costa Rica considered this term in more regionally specific ways.
La comunidad debe ser definida desde dentro, escuchando y respetando su propio discurso de autodeterminación, territorialidad, autogobierno, cosmovisión, memoria histórica y relaciones que la vinculan, comunalidad.
Considering the Caribbean context more deeply, in 2017 I chaired a roundtable during the Carifesta conference held in the University of the West Indies, Barbados, entitled What is a Community Museum in Your Region?, that garnered perspectives from Jamaica, Barbados and Guyana. It included a presentation by the then President of the Museums Association of the Caribbean, Dr. Shireen James Williams. At this roundtable, it was explained that community museums take many forms in the Caribbean, defining a fixed definition and allowing space for adaptation and alternative histories, in contrast to the National Museum model imported from Europe. And for more reading on this topic in the context of the Caribbean, I would point you to a recent monograph by Soares called The Social Museum in the Caribbean, grassroots heritage initiatives and community, which is pretty groundbreaking in this field. Having reflected on community and sustainable museums in the EU and LAC regions in the project compendium, and recognising the need to broaden the discussion geographically, this subject of community-based museums was then taken forward into the steering committee meeting of the EU-LAC Museums project held in Antigua, Guatemala in March 2018. On this occasion, we decided to grapple with the question of definition in a more concrete way and to create a survey on the subject called "What is a Community Museum in Your Region?" This survey was hosted by the University of St Andrews, Qualtrics System and Ethical Approval. It was originally designed in that moment in Antigua in collaboration with the steering committee members, especially, I would say, Dr. Lauren Bonilla Marchev of Costa Rica, and was subsequently edited by the entire consortium and its advisors, notably Peter Davis. The survey results, which I'll show in more detail in the final part of this presentation, have shown that while community museums are largely about the story of a local community, and it's a place that caters for that local community, the community welcomes outside expertise for fostering sustainability, as long as there are clear terms and parity of esteem between the entities. In contrast to the ICOM definition of a museum of 2007, community museums give prominence to people, place, territory, and identity, as well as many definitions provided in the survey reflecting on the intrinsic relationship between the past and the future. In short, community museums are an inclusive and dynamic way of appropriating a community's own memory and experiences in the 21st century. They're not only important, but also essential for fostering peaceful and resilient societies. A great deal can be achieved in and through community-based museums, as distinguished from mainstream museums that are more often associated with certain demographics and funding structures and usually receive state attention and support. Community-based museums offer a lens through which to interrogate both macro and micro, global and local relations, but community museums are often underrepresented in policy directions. Meanwhile, our project findings, indeed funded by the EU and aimed at informing EU research and policy understandings, demonstrates that social engagement and proactive strategies advanced through community-based museums have the potential to challenge and enhance existing policies that seek to contribute to development in Latin America and the Caribbean, thus making these kinds of museums more relevant and sustainable for the future. In a report on our policy roundtable organised in the Directorate General in Brussels, May 2019, our consortium asserted a number of recommendations. These included, I quote, "Community-based museums and heritage initiatives merit more visibility and agency to work through the critical issues affecting human life in the world. Policymakers should put the protection of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, at the heart of youth participation and engagement strategies. Grassroots understanding should be given the opportunity to inform and affect policy in a bottom-up manner, locally, nationally and bi-regionally. Museums should be enabled to lay the groundwork for sustainability by recognising the right to self-determination and by making visible the full range of community voices." And I would just comment as an aside that the consortium is currently working on a second policy roundtable to take place in January in Brussels, indeed online, with the various policymakers in Brussels. Most recently, on the 7th of September 2019, during the 34th General Assembly of ICOM held in Kyoto, there was adopted a resolution entitled Museums, Community and Sustainability. This was resolution number 5. It was conceived as part of the EU-LAC Museums project and submitted by the ICOM regional alliances in Europe and LAC. It marked an historic moment for bi-regional and international cultural cooperation concerning the role of community-based museums in today's world, as well as eco-museums, in that the eco-museum network based in Italy also read and fed back into this resolution as part of the process. But of course, this resolution was not the first to speak to the topic of community museums. In 1995, Resolution 1, adopted in Norway, was on museums and communities. And in 2013, the Rio Conference adopted Resolution number 4 on promoting community museums. So our resolution builds on these through its focus on definitions and by engaging with ideas of sustainable development in particular. Our resolution number 5 highlights the vast number of community-led organisations that do not currently fulfil the ICOM definition of a museum, while recommending the museum community to remain sensitive to local and regional differences and demonstrate awareness of the geopolitical dimension of the concept of the museum, especially relating to the resource needs of community-based museums in lower to middle-income countries. At the same time, it can be noted that Resolution number 1 on sustainability and the implementation of Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World, works in synergy with Resolution number 5 because the first recommendation underlines that community-led museums further the sustainable use of natural, cultural and intangible heritages for environmental, social and economic development of communities towards achievement of the UN 2030 goals and climate justice. So, the EU-LAC Museums project has shown that strong bi-regional relationships and mutual learning are key assets to bringing the global reflection on the roles and definitions of museums in different regions. It's shown that by working closely with communities and linking with local governments, community-based museums can contribute to sustainable development in different contexts and promote development of peaceful and resilient societies. At this point then, I would like to present a brief overview of survey results. This survey was launched by then ICOM President Soares in Antigua, Guatemala in May 2018, and it's been promoted among community museum members in particular, and academics and policymakers through the EU-LAC Museums channels and also through ICOM. By today we've had 414 responses, but I made a first census on the 12th of August 2020 and base these results on that survey. Then there were 364 complete responses from 201 countries, written in English, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese and French. And so, while we can't say this is impressive in quantitative terms, the data has proven insightful in qualitative terms, providing useful insights. So, 16.42% of the participants were from LAC, 13.43% from the EU, and 70.15% from the rest of the world. The largest number were from the UK, largely thanks indeed to the Community Heritage Network in Scotland, led by Cathy Gillis, followed by Japan, thanks to ICOM Kyoto for advertising and disseminating, and also to Kenji Saotomi for advertising it through Japan's network of community museums, followed then by Costa Rica, Peru, Portugal, Canada, the USA and Italy. The targeted advertising through project networks and social media and our webinar series, Community-Based Museums in Times of Crisis, has meant that it has indeed reached a very wide range of countries and an appropriate demographic. So the vast majority of people who responded to the survey said that the organisation or group interested in local or community development of which they are part is what they would call a community museum, as shown on this slide. In answer to the question, are you? A third of responses identified as a person with an interest in community museums, 23% a museum professional, 20% part of an organisation or group interested in local or community development, and 6.5% other. The vast majority of respondents work in a museum type organisation, they would call it, with 17% from community museums and only 11% from academia. Through our networks, the survey also reached some less expected communities, such as the Rastafari in Jamaica and the Sankoy in Mali, both of whom stated that a museum should primarily represent the story of an ethnic group or ancestors. Interestingly, the question, which of the following criteria help to define what a community museum is, saw participants asked to rank their answers in order of priority. So, geographical territory ranked as the top definition, followed by other, followed by a local sense of spirit or place, and then a shared local history. This finding shows a clear diversity of perception of what community-based museums are. It also emphasises the role of place for community museums, very much in line with Peter Davis's discussion of eco-museums as essentially a sense of place. Most tellingly, the question, who is the main public for the community museum, solicited the following response, with local community having the clear majority. When asked what does a community museum need to merit the title, the largest response was, I quote, an education or outreach programme, followed by objects. This finding could mark a key difference between community museums and eco-museums, showing a widely held belief that eco-museums are less focused on objects than on significant sites in a given territory. For the question, why do you think community museums are important? Please comment on the attributes they have and what they might achieve that more traditional museums cannot. The following free text comments were provided. The survey question, can you offer a definition of a community museum, garnered a considerable number of engaged free text responses. A small but very significant finding from analysis of this data, including a word cloud, is that in contrast to the international definitions of a museum such as ICOM, the word people features strongly in the 71 English responses, as well as the word place. Due consideration is also given to the role of the community museum not only in the past, but also in the present and in the future, with local history standing out here as key. Meanwhile, of the 54 Spanish language responses, the words territory feature more strongly, as well as space and identity. So in summary, the EU-LAC Museum survey into what is a community museum in your region has shown that while the community museum is largely about the story of a local community and is a place that caters for the local community, the community does welcome outside expertise, as long as there are these clear terms and esteem between the entities. In contrast to the ICOM definition of museum, we have prominence to people, to place, to territory, and identity as key words, as well as many of the definitions offered reflecting on this relationship between the past and the future in a forward-looking style of museum. In short, community-based museums are an inclusive and dynamic way of appropriating a community's own memory and experiences in the 21st century. As our PI from the Caribbean, Alessandra Cummins, pointed out at the very conception of EU-LAC museums, they're not only important, but also essential for fostering peaceful and resilient societies. Thank you very much for listening.